Many years ago, last century, a young boy sat in front of a black and white television, watching on Doordarshan Sir Kenneth Clarke's History of Civilization. And it was the Inlaks scholarship that allowed me to then go to Oxford and then to Cambridge and then to experience in full color and in real life what I had dreamed of and longed for in that small black and white space in that small bedroom of mine in Janakpuri in West Delhi. So thank you. And I thank the young artists as well for showing us new ways of being and thinking about the world. And since I have just half an hour, which is a ridiculously short time to present anything, I shall proceed straight into it. May we have slide 1, please? Thank you, Malika. So the talk is entitled Space, Voice, and the Anxiety of Influence. And these are the three themes. What is the space in which we do art? How do we find our voice? And the pressure of influence and of originality as we engage in art practice. So these three questions before us, one is the space of art. And here we are caught up in various ways of thinking in larger and smaller ways about who we are and where we project an art practice into. Questions of identity, personal identity, questions of the nation, question of the world, and questions indeed of the world of art. And the first, with relation to identity, these questions of location, where one is, and questions of subjectivity, as we saw in the work of Devashish, who one is, one's caste, one's gender, one's sexual orientation. All of these are questions that impinge on one's practice as one begins to think with images and project sound and image into a world in order that these be received in order to transform. The second is the question of the nation, and this has become a plangent question for us in these times, particularly in India, where this question of what it is to be Indian, what it is to have an Indian art, is it possible to be an Indian and produce art that speaks to the world, or is it necessary as an Indian to produce an art that reflects something of the nation's internal consciousness? These are questions that bear on us. And this thinking from the idea of a national art has been with us since the beginning of the 20th century, whether we think with Rabindranath Tagore, Jamini Roy, Amrita Shergill, M.F. Hussain. The question of authenticity hangs like a specter over our consciousness. Then we have the big themes that address the world at large, and these are questions relating to migration, from the internal migration that we saw during the time of COVID, where there was that vast migration from the west coast of India to the east, as millions of people were cut adrift from their jobs and homes and sought to find a way back, walking along railway tracks and so on. We also seen the great migrations across the ocean by people who do not know how to swim. Syrian migrants who cross the Mediterranean, land up in Lesbos and Lampedusa, and finally find their way into Europe, the subject of a magnificent work by Ai Weiwei. You have questions of climate change, questions of racism, questions of how do we live in the world as human beings rather than as people bound by ethnicity, nationalities, and so on. And these questions are questions of the space of art, which come to our imagination even as we put pen to paper, we put brush to canvas, or indeed we hold a camera before the world. The second question is that of voice, of authorship, of originality. How is it possible to be original? Or is one already part of conversations that have been ongoing for a few hundred years, for a few thousand years perhaps, conversations that move between geographies, across times, which are located not only in personal histories, in national histories, in local histories, but also within the history of art itself. This question of repetition, the question of repetition as difference, the question of originality being repetition in a different way, and always the problem of derivativeness is what one does, something that hinges on, depends on something that has gone before. And there's indeed always been the burden of originality. The anxiety of influence from others is also the anxiety of originality. So when Tagore drew his magnificent sketches in the early 20th century, immediately people were talking about German expressionism. And each time an artist puts a pen to paper, there are these comparisons that are made. And these are the comparisons that we resist as we try and find our own voice. And this we have seen in the world of Indian art as well, whether we look at the work of Pushpamala and her photographs, of Annu Matthews, and immediately critics begin to speak of the work of Cindy Sherman. And this not only grants legitimacy and entry into an art world, but also in some sense gently deflates the idea of originality as emerging from spaces in the global south. So we are caught between this fear of solipsism and the anxiety of influence, even as we produce art. And Devashish, when he talked about his work and he spoke about himself, he was also speaking for others in many senses. So this question of solipsism, where one is turned in on oneself and produces art, it also connects up with the life of others, regardless of whether we intend to or not. And this escaping solipsism and the anxiety of influence may be something that is indeed beyond one. It arises in the conversation between the art, the artist, and the viewer. And this is something that we have to bear in mind. Can we move on to slide 2? Yes. We're used to thinking about the world through our nations, through the continents, and so on, but this is the Earth from the side of the Pacific Ocean. As we know, 70% of the surface of the Earth is water. And this is something that we tend to forget. And my own work has looked at oceans and the continuing migration of humans across national borders, where nations are a very young entity. They came into existence in the 19th and in the 20th century. India, as a nation, as we know, exists only from 1947. But the movement of people across water, across mountains, across borders, has existed from 40,000 years ago, when the first anatomically modern beings, human beings, made their way all the way from Africa to Polynesia. And it is this migration that has created the world, and it laughs at the idea of borders. And we have to think about the ways in which, if we are to go back to the idea of the nation, of a national art, how impoverished these ideas may be when we think about the space into which we speak, the histories that attend on our consciousness as we draw or paint or write, and the impoverished nature of our political theory, where we are forced to think with the restrictive idea of the citizen rather than the open idea of the stranger, the refugee, the migrant. And this again speaks, I suppose, to Arpita's work. What does it mean to have come from Bangladesh into India, right? East Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, very transient nominal identities, which have been characterized by the constant flow of people over many hundreds of years. One of the writers who has consistently dealt with this is a former Inlaks scholar, Amitav Ghosh. And in his wonderful book, The Great Derangement, he talks about how in our literary work and in our artistic production, we have not really acknowledged the fact that the world is not ours to despoil, that there is global warming, there is climate change, that we stand indeed on the precipice, right? We are like the animals in Noah's Ark. As the waters rise around us, we are burdened with these anxieties, but what are we doing about it? And we look to our social sciences and our humanities and our theoretical texts. It very often, the idea of global warming and climate change appears on the fringes of our thinking, and it's not central. And in his second book, The Nutmeg's Curse, Amitav Ghosh goes on to speak about our attitude to nature as something that stands outside us. Nature is something that we act upon, rather than our belonging to nature. Some of the images that Rishita Noy showed of the animals that cross the road, raising the very plungent question of why did the animal cross the road, right? I mean, rather like why did the chicken cross the road? But the question of the idea of our being part of nature, that regardless of whether there are insects, snakes, humans, that we are all part of one entity which is being endangered by the actions of humans. And the standing apart from nature, rendering nature an object, is the reason why we are in the crisis that we are. And we have seen earlier art movements which have attempted to relate to the idea of nature very much as we know through Joseph Beuys's found objects. Nature is something that exists, which can be reclaimed by the human, We have the transient, ephemeral works in nature of Andrew Goldsworthy, his magical land art, and so on. But how are we to actually think about an art that addresses the most exigent question of our time, right? That it is the water next time that will claim humanity and its hubris of civilization. Can you move on to slide 3? This is a series done by the South African artist Gideon Mendel, a series of photographs titled Drowning World. And what he does is to photograph people in their houses with the water up to their necks, in places as far-ranging as Denmark, Australia, Latin America, in this case, Bihar, Muzaffarpur, Bangladesh, and so on, reminding us that when the waters rise in the continuous oceans that we separate into different names like Atlantic, Pacific, Indian, but when the waters rise, the waters will rise as one. And regardless of where we are, these distinctions of the first world, the second world, the global south, the global north, this will cease to matter. Rich or poor, we will be standing in water up to our neck. So this is the question that is before us. And it's the idea of a common human predicament, that when we speak, when we write, when we draw, we are addressing something that is central to all of humanity, right? Slide 4, please. So this question of contemporary life, and this is something that's a question that Azad raised very early on when he talked about the artist in the world. Being in India and as artists in India and living in the times that we do in India, where there is an attempt to divide Indians from each other, there is a growing upswell of violence and so on, how do we render the contemporary in India? And here is Savi Savarkar, a Dalit artist, with this wonderful piece called Spittoon and Swastika. Spittoon marking the hierarchy, the cruel hierarchy of caste, and swastika as being the figure that stands above this, of a certain kind of religious nationalism, and reminding us that in a society marked by caste, not all human lives are equal. And this is the lesson that we learn from Dr. Ambedkar. And Riaz Komu, in his recent engagement with Gandhi and Ambedkar, and particularly in the sketches that he has drawn, has rendered the contemporary in India through a series of very chilling sketches that take us all the way from the violence of partition to the contemporary lynchings of Muslims and Dalits, reminding us that this is not a present history. This is not an immediate conjuncture, that this has been a feature of contemporary life. And as an artist, it is necessary to attend to this. So in that sense, we are reminded of the great Black sociologist, W.B. Du Bois's phrase that all art is propaganda. All art, in some sense, speaks to a present of division, speaks to a present of political alignment, speaks to a present in which humanity is denied its value. And if we think about that art that was produced in Bengal during the Great Famine of 1942, when we had Chitta Prasad and Zainul Abidin, and a certain kind of progressive art that emerged out of the crucible of the famine, where the artist draws into a space and a time. Right? There is something that, regardless of where the wellsprings of one's imagination comes from, it speaks to an immediate present that weighs on us. The second question that we need to think about is, if we think about art also as addressing the contemporary, we're also speaking about a space of connection, a space of translation. We think about the Kochi Biennale and the dialogue that is emerging across the global south, where artists from Iran, from Vietnam, from Palestine, from India are speaking to each other and moving out of a national solipsism into conversation. That the contemporary and the world as it is a situation that unites all of us across these artificial borders, what Amitav Ghosh called the shadow lines in the dust. And we're thinking about these big themes about capitalism, about democracy, about migration, the detritus of imaginations of equality like socialism, non-alignment, the third world, and so on. And we're thinking about these connected histories across, so that the history of caste in India comes to be connected with the history of race and racial hierarchies in the US. And if one thinks about the present crisis of art, where what we're seeing before us is the challenge. Is art meant to be lasting? Are monuments meant to be lasting? There are these debates going on about the toppling of statues, statues which are meant to be there forever, statues of Churchill, statues of Rhodes, Cecil Rhodes, and also the fact that we are thinking about the repatriation of objects that were taken away by colonialism. Now there's a repatriation of the Menon bronzes, which is at the heart of the ongoing history of the relations between Europe and Africa. And how are we to think about art, monumentality, the forever nature of art, the changing politics that allows people to see objects of art? And these questions are crucial. A very interesting example is in 1995, when the German artist Horst Hoheisel responded to a competition to design a Berlin memorial for the murdered Jews of Europe. And what he said was, just blow up the Brandenburg Gate, and the scorched earth would become a new Holocaust monument. So what he was saying here was that the absence of something is also a monument to a memory, right? And so when we think about all of these debates that are circulating around us, of the Rhodes Must Fall movement, whether it's the casting aside of statues of slavers into the waters in Bristol and so on, that we're thinking about the place of art within a very divided world with many violent histories that attend on our thinking. Finally, when we think about in the contemporary, we also have to think about what we mean by society in a space that is characterized by a lack of fraternity. This was something that Ambedkar pointed out for India, that we have equality, which can be legislated by the Constitution. We have liberty that can be legislated by the Constitution, but we cannot legislate fraternity into existence. We cannot make people behave equally with one another under the law. And the history of touch in India, that touch is something that we deny another human being, and that is part of the way in which social life is conducted. So the question really is, do we talk about Indian society, and how do we talk about it in meaningful ways? I keep saying that cricket is a wonderful game that exemplifies this. It's a sport that everybody plays because no one has to touch one another. Unlike football, so it's a very Indian game in many ways. So this question of how do we render the contemporary is a question that stands before us. Let's move on to slide 5. In slide 5, many of you would know N.N. Rimzan, another Inlaks artist. And what I want to put before you towards the end of the talk are two ways of thinking. Right? This particular painting by Rimzan, acrylic on canvas, is fortunately for me titled Untitled, which allows me to then interpret it in any way I choose, which I shall now proceed to do. And I think this painting allows for me an image of putting together many of the themes that I've been speaking about. And what I want you to do is, as I speak, to think in your minds of Tagore's poem from Gitanjali, right? Where the mind is without fear. Chitto jetha bhoy shunno uccho jetha shir, that poem. And to play those lines as I speak, because I shall be recalling many of the images from Tagore. So if you look at this image here in front of us, there are 4 different realms here. And I shall go through the 4 realms, which allow us to imagine the enterprise of art. The first is that startling blue pond at the bottom, the clear pond of vision and reason, which speaks to the genius of the artist's perception, a certain kind of clarity, right? A certain kind of clarity, and that blue is very reminiscent of Anish Kapoor's blue, and the color blue, which evokes infinity. It invokes the infinity of the sky and of water. It invokes the color of Krishna. Sufis have the color blue as central to their idea of transcendence. The idea of blue is something that allows us to think about the clear stream of reason that allows us to see the world, see through the world, and to visualize the world differently. This is the genius of the artist. The second place is that of that house. Now, the question is whether the door is shut. Is the door open and there is darkness inside? There is no human being. We do not know what is inside the house. It is an enclosed space. We can assume that one thinks from within those walls, right? Think again about that line from Tagore, where the world has not been divided into narrow domestic walls. This is a space of confinement, but this is also the space of thinking. And all of us have known spaces of confinement as the spaces of thinking during COVID, all through 2021. So this house represents a kind of solipsism, a thinking from within oneself, thinking about oneself, thinking about the world and thinking about oneself in the world. The third is the level of those dense intermingling branches above which blot out the sky. It's dense branches that obscure the sky, which speaks about local entanglements, the desire to see which is being obscured by the darkness of the foliage, the dreary branches of dead habit, to paraphrase Tagore from his poem. And it's actually both about an engaged art and the requirement for art to engage with that which stands between the clear reason, the desire to reflect on the world, and the entanglements that stand in our way as we reflect on the world. And finally, at the higher level, you have the universe with its vastness, the planets, the stars, the heaven of freedom. Into that heaven of freedom, let my country awake, right? The space of cosmopolitan humanism where we learn how to speak to each other. As artists and as humans, we transcend the narrow barriers and identities that separate us. We learn how to reach out and touch. The element that is so governed by censorship and limitations within Indian society. So it's asking us to reach out and touch beyond those branches, to reach out to a humanism and of the universe that awaits us. Can we move on to the next slide? This slide shows Alfredo Yar's work, Cloud for Kochi 2012 at the Kochi Biennale. And in many senses, this this installation for me reflects a resolution of some of the problems raised in Rimson's painting. It collapses the many distinctions that I've drawn out, right? Of the inwardness of the house, the entanglements of the thickets, the cosmopolitan humanism, which is the reaching out to an ideal, and then that clear stream of reason from which all thought emerges. Because what you have here is a dank go-down, a dank, abandoned go-down with stagnant water. It's a dark space, it's a smelly space. Those of you who've been to the Kochi Biennale know it's hot, it's uncomfortable. You have all these unknown smells which have overlaid each other over the centuries, smells of jute, pepper, sweat, the sweat of labor that has been forgotten. But in that space, Yar manages to do something spectacular. What does he do? Amidst the smells of a commerce and a dead colonialism, he shows us this image in fluorescent lighting. The image above the water is in reverse. You can only read it by looking into the water, right? When in its reflection. So suddenly that dark, stagnant water, the space where history seems to have come to die, becomes the space which allows us to read, to visualize what Yar has put up on the wall. And the dark, dank water speaks to us in a kind of very contradictory and oxymoronic sense. And just the dark here that translates the light. Right? It's the dark water that allows us to see what is visually very resonant, full of effulgence, and so on. What is the verse that's up there? The verse that is up there is from Meghadutam, Kalidasa's Meghadutam, from the 3rd century of the Christian era. And what does the verse speak about? The cloud messenger. It speaks about wandering. It speaks about longing. It speaks about love. It speaks about union. And suddenly, in that dark, stagnant space, there is an imagination that floats free. And it speaks to a much vaster geography than can ever be contained by that room. Because here is a yaksha who's exiled in central India, who's sending a message through the cloud to his beloved. And the message floats, regardless of borders, unheeding of boundaries, escaping the narrow spaces of confinement. And suddenly you are here looking at the mobility that water generates, right? Which comes back to my own work on the oceans and of water and thinking with water. So when you walk into the room and you see the stagnant water, suddenly the stagnant water is animated by Kalidasa's verse, which allows us to move back a few thousand years in time, and also to imagine the connections between Brazil and India, and Brazil and Kerala. Alfredo Yar drawing upon the memories of slaves who were shipped from Kerala all the way to Bahia in Brazil. Multiple historical memories that are in a world that comes into existence in this room. So what we have here is the idea of connections. So to go back to the question that I posed earlier, that we are constantly drawn, as it were, between solipsism and reaching out. And here what we have is an artist who, in the very act of creating a work of art, creates these multiple connections, filiations across the world, and creates a conversation that speaks across time and across space. The world in a grain of sand, the world in a dark room. I'll stop there. Thank you.